Um, so begin with the project and why it matters. So here's the research hypothesis. I want to argue that, or we want to argue that a diachronically unified self is not needed as a locus of moral development. Now, for those of you who are philosophers are familiar with Parfit's view, and this is a much stronger claim than Parfit's view. Parfit argued something much weaker. He said a diachronically identical self, the same thing over time, is not required. You can make sense of all our practices, everything, without presuming diachronic identity. This is a much stronger claim. This is the Buddhist claim. Not only there is no diachronic identity, the Buddhists even deny continuity over time. And I will make that clear. So the way of establishing this hypothesis, we will do a two-part thing conceptually, just by looking at arguments in the Buddhist texts, a particular era, the Abhidharma Buddhist philosophy, and empirically, that's the work that Chadha does by appeal to neuroscientific studies using neurophenomenological real-time MRI techniques. I know it's a mouthful. I will explain it. Don't worry. You'll all know it by the end of today. And the technique does involve using expert meditators, and I explain why that's important too. So what I want to spend a minute on is when we are talking about the self, we've been talking about many different selves in presentations. There's been the narrative self, the moral self, the ontological self, and so on. The self here means the ontological self, understood as something that possesses qualities, is a subject of experience, has traits, and endures over time. That's the self I'm denying. I'm probably not denying a narrative self, and we'll get clear about, why not. So the only self I want to deny is the self in the ontological sense. And that's a big part of the project, the SMV project, and I'm going to question that assumption. Here's why it matters, and here's how this links up with the project at hand. So I think, and the directors might correct me on this, that the SMV project, like most other psychological and philosophical perspectives, does assume a diachronically unified self as the locus of moral development. Two reasons why I think that. I think they're talking about character traits as enduring over time, makes me feel this assumption is implicit, and also talking about the moral self. I put moral self as an organic whole. These are both, from the project website. I put a question mark in the moral self because I don't know. I'm not very clear about how exactly they think of the moral self. If moral self includes or assumes an ontological self, then we are in disagreement. If moral self does not include an ontological self, then perhaps we don't need to disagree that much. So I have left that question as an open question, perhaps for discussion. What exactly do the project directors mean by moral self? Does it entail an ontological self diachronically unified over time or not? Okay, so this is the crucial question. How do we conceive of the self, the bearer of character traits, and the locus of moral development? My answer, following the Abhidharma Buddhists, is there is no self, blank statement, and ultimately no useful purpose is served by conceiving a self. There's emphasis on really there is no self, no diachronically unified entity, and also on ultimately. The Buddhists have a distinction between ultimate truth and conventional truth. Conventionally, there might be a purpose served by conceiving of a self, but not ultimately. Ultimately, we'd be better off forgetting about a self. And what me and Chadha want to argue, and we really believe this, that what the Buddhist picture does is gives us an intellectually and morally preferable, alternative worldview without a self. And I'm going to argue for both of those. It's kind of a revisionary metaphysics that they put. It's not describing how we think about the self. It's getting us to rethink about our conceptual scheme, the way we take ordinarily take things to be. So in Strawson's spirit, it's a revisionary metaphysics without a self. Okay, and so let me, sort of spend a few minutes on the Buddhist view very quickly, what the Abhidharma view is, what the denial of self amounts to, and then we'll go on to, you'll see why this answer is counterintuitive. So think of these as individual monima, right? And according to the Buddhists, what an individual is a bundle of physical and mental states. These blue lines are physical and mental states bound together by causal relations, right? And this is me at 3, 30, 60, 90. I hope I don't live that long, but. And according to them, these causal and these mental and physical states keep changing over time. In fact, the Abhidharma model says, but I won't have time to go into the details of it, they change momentarily, moment by moment. These are replaced by new, but roughly the picture is this. And then what the Buddhists want to say is the only thing that binds together various life stages of a person, consider them as momentary stages, is causal relations. That's another individual, that's another individual. But in reality, what happens is there are causal relations between individuals as well. There are all these kinds of relations. So the Buddhist claim is that you cannot say that this monima is specifically an individual, because the kind of relation that binds various stages of me, person stages of me, is the very same kind of relation that binds me to other persons. So really the picture is that I'm continuous with all other living beings around me. The kind of relation I have to my 90-year-old self, the Buddha says perhaps you're better off, giving up that self-concern for the 90-year-old self, because you're probably more closely related to people around you. You might be, just as distant from your future self as much distance as you have from other selves. So that's the kind of Buddhist picture. Whether you draw, this is what I mean by saying, there is no self, whether you draw this line, I don't want to draw hard lines because they might suggest that there is really an individual. It could be this way, I could be continuous with this, and so on and so forth. I causally influence my students. My students, have much more in common with me, I think, than my 90-year-old self is likely going to have in the future. So that's the Buddhist claim, and it is indeed counterintuitive, no doubt. And one of the ways in which our position is innovative is we try and defend this really hard, really strong claim. Most other Buddhists, including, an early sect of Buddhists in the 7th century, the Pudgalvadins, which really is the personalist school of Buddhism, plus some very famous philosophers, Evan Thompson and Ganeri. I don't have the time to explain these quotes, but they give you definitions of, but there is a self. There is no self, but, there is. So everyone tries to weaken the blow, soften the position, because otherwise the position is way too counterintuitive. But we want to stick with the counterintuitive position and argue there is room for motivation, there's room for moral motivation, there's room for virtue, all of that. And in fact, there is more room for all of that, even if we stick to the hard position. That's what we want to. I'm not going to explain those quotes. Okay, so here's one way of thinking about why it might be a positive contribution rather than just a negative contribution to the SMV project. Naves argues that, Martin's notion of a common self, and when I read the definition of common self on the website, it said exactly this, that encompasses the web of life, which includes the larger community and the natural environment as a part of oneself. So, that's exactly the kind of picture you might think that underlies the argument given by Martin, as far as I could understand, is an anthropological argument. I think what the Buddhist offers you here is an epistemological argument for the same claim. It's very difficult to make the distinction between ourself and others. It's an artificial distinction that we draw. And if we drop that distinction, we might have an epistemological argument for the common self. And I think personally the common self is a good candidate for the moral self. That's how we should think of it. And if we think of it as a narrative self, that's fine too, provided we make sure we are not claiming an ontological self in the background as well. Okay, so here are our research goals. We want to defend the hypothesis, as I said, conceptually and empirically, by using an important insight by Moore and Winquist in the 2002 paper. It's a huge review paper, as you get one in 10 years. And they say there's a connection between self-related thinking, or self-focused attention, as they call it. We want to generalize it to self-related thinking and negative affect. And I think we can use the Buddhist Abhidharma theory to argue that, in fact, there is a relation between self-related thinking. The more I think about my future self, the more I think about my past self, the more anxious, the more, desirous I get. And so I can argue that, indeed, there is such a connection, and we can establish this empirically as well. So let's get to deep integration. So what the deep integration in our project is between conceptual claims and empirical claims. Conceptual claims, depend upon the Buddhist Abhidharma no-self view, together with, it comes with their ontology and psychology of mental states, much more sophisticated than this crude analysis here, which also underlies the practice of mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation is actually a way of seeing things as they really are. The Buddhists say that when you, in the deep meditative states, you do see the discontinuity of self. That's meant to be what, you finally get to. And I've argued this in various papers, if any of you are interested. And then the Buddhist claim is also that knowledge together with sustained, so knowledge of the Abhidharma theory together with the sustained practice of meditation leads to a firm and true understanding of what the world is really like. It is like this, that's what they want to claim. And this will result in a reorientation of our attitudes. Rather than thinking about our future self, we will start concentrating on, other selves, other contemporary selves, and be more compassionate. Here are the empirical claims which are important to the deep integration. Mindfulness meditation works by disengaging the self from particular kinds of self-related thinking, a result well known since 2007. Mindfulness meditation works by quietening one area of the brain, the PCC, posterior, again well established by these scientists, I believe them. And together with this thesis that I mentioned before from Moore and Winquist, what we want to argue that negative emotions like craving and anxiety can be diminished by reduction in self-related thinking. So give up the self-related thinking, give up the belief in self, and you will be more motivated to be more compassionate and generally more virtuous. That's the claim. So just to give you a guide to the method here, I don't think I have the time to go into explaining what the method is, but I'm happy to explain it in questions. It's an important study in which my co-investigator was involved in 2013. What this study suggests is two things. I mean, there was worry about self-report earlier in the discussions we've had, can we take self-reports? And there is reason to believe that expert meditators are also experts in introspection. They have a better sense of their own internal states. And also, an important result come out recently is that they can volitionally modulate, control their own brain activity. These two are very important results, which, kind of give the framework for our program. So just very quickly what the real-time neurofeedback means. So here's a slide. The red bit is the PCC activation, and the blue bit is the PCC deactivation. So when a person is meditating, the blue bit gets activated. And so at the beginning, when you start doing the meditation, you're trying to guess, when the words are going to end. And so when I'm trying to meditate, and you see that spike there. And then I sort of immediately settle into it. This is an expert meditator talking while he's seeing the feedback on a screen. Brain is, in an fMRI machine. And I was really getting settled, blue. read again, oh my gosh, this is amazing. The machine is doing exactly what I think my mind is doing. And the minute you do that, a red spike again because you're out of the meditation. Back again, okay, don't get distracted, get back into meditation. And, this is unbelievable. This is exactly a perfect map of what my mind is doing. Anyway, so that's the thing we want to use. So I've given you an insight into method to show that, neurophenomenological techniques can be used to distinguish self-related from non-self-related thinking. Don't have time for anticipated challenges and responses. Very quickly, I'll leave it on this last slide for people, how this integrates with the SMB project.
Thank you.
So could you say a little bit about how you see the neurofeedback paradigm providing evidence in relation to the lack of a diachronic self?
The neurophenomenological feedback provides that evidence by its connection with self-related thinking. If we have a firm belief that there is no self, and we know every time we involve ourselves in self-related thinking, so thinking about my future, thinking about my past, the negative emotions seem to crowd. So what the neurofeedback does is only tells you about, with sustained meditative practices, you can actually modulate your activity of self-related thinking. Yeah. You can modulate your mind away from self-related thinking. And so I guess, how it gives evidence against diachronic self is to say that a diachronic self-related thinking is rooted in this conception of a diachronic self. And if self-related thinking can be given up, we need to get rid of this self. It's related through, negative affect and self-related thinking. It's the connection between self-related.
So given that posterior cingulate activity is modulated not just by that particular kind of motivated, directed attention, do you anticipate having a control of another kind of focused attention? So instead of attention on the self, attention on the tube that's around you, or attention on plans for tomorrow, or something like that. In other words, since focused attention in general will modulate PCC activity, maybe it's not the self-focus, but it could be...
It is the self, it's not focused attention, it's mindfulness meditation. It's the expert meditators who are able to modulate their activity. And, when we're looking at expert meditators here, I'm thinking of, people who understand most of the subjects, in fact, who are involved in Brewer's study in the past have been Buddhist monks. I think they're aware of the Buddhist theory. So, part of doing this is to confirm the result that it's just not by any old method that, attending to any old object, you will be able to do it. What you have to get rid of is self-related thinking. And if the object becomes the self, then it is going to be very difficult to get rid of the self-related thinking. You start focusing on the self. And so the objective here is to get rid of the self-related thinking. And the theory is supposed to help to motivate you. And the Buddhist view, now I cannot confirm this, but the Buddhist view is that mindfulness meditation is actually empirical confirmation for each and every person for themselves, to see it for themselves. The Buddha never believed that you believe what the teacher tells you. The Buddha always said, experience it for yourself. That's the final test. And higher stages of mindfulness meditation are meant to be exactly that.
Dan, and then Owen.
Thanks for your talk. The self is a very complex construct in psychology.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure which self is being denied in the non-self, when you say the no-self perspective. Going back to William James, there's a distinction between the I-self and the me-self, for example, and some of what you describe as at least the weaker version of the no-self sounds like kind of I-self position, and I don't know what hinges on the ontological self versus maybe a psychological self. I don't know if that's a useful distinction. But I'd like to challenge you on two claims. that self-focused attention is related to negative affect and your denial of the future self. As a notion. You know, there is a tradition in social psychology that goes back to the 70s that, you know, the objective self-awareness paradigm, you know, that indicate that when you increase self-awareness, that will attune you to whatever norms are salient in your environment. And so that would be an example of how increased self-awareness can actually attune you to moral norms. And so that's a perspective I think we lose if we go down the direction of, you know, your view of no self. The second is, it seems like the idea of moral progress requires some notion of the future self, doesn't it? You want to aspire to a goal. You want to be better. You want to be excellent. And so having some vision of yourself as an idealized moral person in the future seems to have a regulative pool on how we conduct ourselves now. So I guess I'd like to hear more about anything I've said here.
Good. I think, you know, that kind of gives me an opportunity to say a bit about why I thought, you know, talking about the giving up the ontological self does not mean giving up all kinds of self. You know, narrative self, it's a construction. That's the important thing. And, you know, as long as we realize it is a construction only, it is something we construct, you know, an identity we construct by telling narratives. And I think, you know, moral self in that sense too. Having this ontological self, you know, gives you this notion of, you know, there is something I've got this special relationship with this future thing. And so I have to concentrate. That's the normal, you know, state. We have this concern for our future self, which kind of overwhelms our concern for others. You know, and well, we have concern for others, but those that are related to me, mine, you know, it does not sort of extend the compassion to all beings around us. So the idea is, if you like, you know, in the Buddhist no-self claim was to shift attention from self to no-self, so that at least there is a shift of focus from self-concern to concern for the other. You know, in the background of Hindu belief, this was perhaps important for them. So yes, you know, self-awareness is not a bad thing, but self-awareness, I mean, the Buddhists have a story to tell about self-awareness. I don't know, but maybe John Donne will be talking about it. They have a story. They're not denying self-awareness at all. So, you know, the kind of perspective that you're talking about can perhaps be integrated into this. I hope we'll not lose it. I was hoping we're not going to lose a moral self, a narrative self, and all the others. But I only want to push that we better get rid of the ontological self. That's the idea.
Owen?
So, thank you. This is a kind of a methodological question. So, I get the picture that your idea is that mindful recognition that the self is a less permanent diamond in the rough that is me and would break down, that helps dissolve self-egoistic, self-concern, and in breaking down the boundaries of self, one feels, now here's the $24,000 question or whatever they call it, that one feels more solidarity with the other, and it has something to do with virtue, but the worry is that actually people have been saying that for a really, really long time, and one would like empirical evidence that people who believe that they are no self actually are more compassionate or loving or whatever. And one might worry, have you ever worried about this, that mindfulness practices are practiced by lucky elite people who you know, sort of sit around and are kind of self-absorbed, one might say. So so one could think about wanting to study actually what effect this has on behavior, as opposed to, because I thought that was very interesting about your proposal, the sort of linkage between believing that one is not a self, capital S, and being virtuous, but I don't quite see how the research methods that you're proposing do much more than, in your side, analyze textual evidence that this is an orthodox Buddhist belief, which I agree with you it is. Yeah. And then secondly, finding that in mindfulness practice, expert meditators, in fact, believe the orthodox view. So okay. You get the idea.
Yeah, let me say this thing, and tell me if it works for you. I mean, the way MBSR started, especially in North America, it became popular in elitist circles. I completely agree with that claim. And I think it was giving up all the religious baggage, quote unquote, if Buddhism is a religion at all. But, the idea was to sort of put it forward and make it popular as a secular practice. And it gained a lot of momentum because it had really good effects for people who were practicing it. I mean, the amount of research on mindfulness, they're better persons, they can control addiction, they can control their craving, they can even, there's been some studies done at Harvard that you can reverse the process of aging. So, mindfulness, here's one reason really to do mindfulness. If you get nothing else out of my talk, get that. I think we're all worried about that. Rather than, spending money buying it, sort of revitalizing creams, whatever those are, I don't know what to call them, go for mindfulness. Because there is actual evidence. There's a Lazar study from Harvard done in 2010 that the folds in our brain, in the cortices, become thinner. But if you do mindfulness meditation over a period of time, actually, it helps to keep those folds in. So, I think there is plenty of reason to think that, we are better off. But I think Arvind is quite right. You're thinking, I am better off in a lot of ways. I can get rid of anxiety and this, that, and the other for me. But, is there really evidence? But I think, people now realize it is now time to go back and put mindfulness back in its context. It has had its day, it's become popular, it's sparked off all this research back in its context, and then to really see that this is meant to be, the practice, and this is how it's meant to work. So the idea is, not to think of mindfulness in a vacuum, but force people to think that mindfulness is in this tradition, and this is how it's meant to be understood and conceived. So that's...
Thank you. We're out of time. Thanks.